The range went quiet the moment she missed. Not because a miss was unusual. Misses happened all the time at CFB Suffield. The wind came off the Alberta plains in angles that defied prediction, and even the best shooters on the base had days where the target and the bullet refused to agree. But this miss was different. This miss happened in front of Major Kellner. And Major Kellner had come to Suffield specifically to watch Corporal Avery Strand shoot. She didn't move. She didn't look up. She recalculated. The other shooters on the line, 6 men, all of them senior to her in time, served if not in rank, exchanged a look. Sergeant Vickers let out a breath through his nose. That wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't quite not one either. Kellner said nothing. He had a clipboard, and he was writing something down, which was worse. Strand adjusted her elevation by 0.3 milliradians. She slowed her breathing until the pause between exhale and inhale stretched to 4 seconds 5. The crosshair settled. She squeezed, not pulled. A distinction that sounds academic until you understand that pulling introduces lateral force, and lateral force at 800 meters means the difference between a hit and a story someone tells about a miss. The steel plate rang. Kellner wrote something else on his clipboard. He didn't say anything then either, and Strand would later think that the silence before and the silence after had very different textures. One dense with judgment, one simply empty, waiting to be filled. She had come to Suffield from Gagetown, which meant she had come from the east, which meant that a certain percentage of the people on this base had already decided, before meeting her, that she was probably too cautious, too by the book, and almost certainly better at paperwork than fieldwork. This was not a policy. It was not spoken aloud. It was simply the water that particular environment swam in, and it had been for as long as anyone could remember. Her record did not support this assessment. At Gagetown, Strand had qualified expert on every range assessment for 3 consecutive years. She had also, in her second year, quietly solved a ballistics discrepancy that had been affecting C3A1 performance in low humidity conditions. A calculation error in the baseline data that no one had caught because no one had thought to cross-reference the ammunition batch records against the atmospheric readings for each session. She had done this in her own time in the evenings in a notebook she kept in her left breast pocket. She had not made a presentation. She had simply left a corrected data sheet in the appropriate binder, with a note that said, "I think this might account for the drift issue." It had. Nobody made a formal fuss about it. But the warrant officer in charge of range operations had quietly begun asking her opinion on things, which was its own form of acknowledgement. None of this information had arrived at Suffield ahead of her. What had arrived was the fact of her gender, her age, 29, and the notation that she had been recommended for a precision fires evaluation by a major whose name most people here didn't recognize. These facts were interpreted differently by different people on the base. Sergeant Vickers interpreted them as a public relations exercise. Corporal Haig interpreted them as someone somewhere covering their ass on a diversity metric. Lieutenant Wren, who ran range operations, interpreted them as an administrative inconvenience that would consume 3 days of his scheduling. Major Kellner, who had made the recommendation, had not explained himself to any of these people because he did not feel he owed them an explanation. The evaluation was scheduled over 3 days. The first day was standard. Known distances, controlled conditions, the kind of shooting that any qualified candidate should be able to do cleanly. Strand did it cleanly. This was noted but not celebrated. Several of the men watching had expected competence, because incompetence would have been too obvious a setup, and they were sophisticated enough to understand that the interesting part came later. The second day introduced variables. Wind readings taken every 15 minutes and provided to the shooters. Changing light, targets at distances that required genuine calculation, not muscle memory. This was where Strand began to separate herself from the baseline. She shot a 97. Vickers shot an 84 on the same course, which was a solid score, a respectable score, the score of a man who was good at his job. He knew this. What made him quiet in the truck on the way back to the main building was not that he had done badly. It was that she had done better, and that the gap was not small enough to attribute to luck. He didn't say anything that night. He thought things, but he had enough discipline not to say them. Some men have this discipline and some do not, and the distinction matters more than people acknowledge. The third day was Kellner's design, and it was not standard. Kellner had set up a scenario. Not a range exercise, a scenario. There was a role player. There was a communications element. There was a problem that could not be solved by shooting alone. The scenario was this. A forward observation post had been compromised. There was a shooter somewhere in an arc of approximately 140 degrees at an unknown distance between 600 and 1,100 meters, using a weapon that had fired twice. 2 brass casings had been recovered. The wind was variable. The time of day meant the sun was quartering from the northwest. The candidate's job was to determine the likely firing position from the available evidence, and if they could, confirm it. There was a right answer. Kellner knew the right answer because he had designed the problem. Strand stood at the observation point for 4 minutes without speaking. One of the evaluation staff, Corporal Tate, who was there to observe, not to help, later said that watching her stand there was a little unnerving because she wasn't still the way someone frozen is still. She was still the way a calculation is still. Everything happening inside, nothing leaking out. She asked for the atmospheric data from the 2 shots. She asked about the ground texture, specifically whether the soil in the northwest quadrant was recently disturbed or wind compacted. She asked what time the shots had been fired and whether the shooter had known they were being observed or had believed they were undetected. These questions told Kellner more than the answers would. She identified a position on a reverse slope at 847 meters. She was off by 11 meters. In a real scenario, 11 meters would have been close enough. Vickers, running the same scenario, had identified 3 possible positions and been unable to narrow further. This was a valid approach. It was not the same approach. After the evaluation concluded, Kellner gathered everyone in the range building. He said some general things about the week. He thanked the evaluation staff. He mentioned that the full results would be compiled and transmitted through the appropriate channels. Then he said, "Corporal Strand, can you walk me through your reasoning on the slope position?" It was not a question. She walked him through it. She talked about the casing ejection pattern and what it implied about the shooter's body position. She talked about using the sun angle to reverse engineer sightline. She talked about the soil compaction question. If the area had been wind compacted, the shooter would have left a visible depression even at distance. She talked about why a reverse slope made sense given the time of shots and the presumed intent to remain undetected. When she finished, the room was quiet. Not the same quiet as the first day's miss. This was a different texture again, the kind that follows when people are recalibrating something they thought they already understood. Vickers was staring at the wall to her left. His jaw was set in the way jaws set when someone is working very hard not to react visibly. What happened after was not in the official record and would not appear in any report. After Kellner left, and after most of the evaluation staff had dispersed, Strand was doing a final equipment check at her station when Vickers came to stand near her. He didn't come to her station directly. He came to the station adjacent, which was empty, and began doing something with a range bag that didn't need doing. "You had help on that last scenario," he said. He kept his voice level. This was perhaps the most revealing thing about what he said, not the content, but the effort it took to keep it level. Strand continued her equipment check. "The atmospheric data in the casings," she said. "Same as everyone." "That's not what I mean." She looked at him then. "I know what you mean, Sergeant." The word sergeant landed in a specific way, not disrespectful, but exact. She was acknowledging his rank without conceding his authority over the facts. He picked up the range bag. "Enjoy the result," he said. "While it holds." She watched him walk out. Corporal Tate, who had been at the far end of the range building and had heard this exchange without being seen, later said that Strand stood motionless for approximately 3 seconds after Vickers left. Then she went back to the equipment check. Tate said she'd seen people handle that kind of moment in a lot of different ways, and that going back to the equipment check was, in his experience, the rarest response and probably the most accurate measure of someone's actual composure. The results were transmitted 6 days later. Strand was recommended for advanced precision fires training, which was the outcome Kellner had been assessing for. She would leave for the program in 8 weeks. The letter was standard, formal language, appropriate notations, but Kellner had written a one-paragraph addendum in his own assessment section that was not standard. He wrote that her analytical approach to the final scenario demonstrated a form of spatial and probabilistic reasoning that could not be taught in the conventional sense, that it could be refined and given tools, but that the underlying architecture was either present in a candidate or it was not. He wrote that he had seen this quality in 3 other shooters over his career, and that all 3 had gone on to records that the institution was still drawing on. He did not write her name in the addendum. He had been advised years ago that the most durable recommendations were the ones that described rather than labeled, because labels created targets and descriptions created reputations. Strand did not know about the addendum. She would not know about it for another 2 years. The program she entered was held at a training facility outside Wainwright. There were 11 candidates. She was the only woman and the only one from an Eastern base, which meant she was, again, starting from a position of double otherness. She would have to establish both her competence and her belonging from scratch, in a compressed window, with people who had already had 3 weeks together before she arrived. She arrived on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had established the competence. The belonging took longer and came from an unexpected direction. The program's lead instructor was a warrant officer named Faulds, a compact, humorless man who had spent 17 years in precision roles and who communicated almost entirely in corrections. He did not offer praise. He offered silence, which his candidates had learned to read as the closest he came to approval. When Faulds said nothing, you had done the thing right. In her second week, during a practical exercise that required shooters to calculate corrections under time pressure with degraded equipment, Strand completed the problem 40 seconds faster than the next candidate and within a margin of 0.4 menoe. Faulds said nothing. She understood. What she did not expect was that Corporal Hebert, a francophone from Valcartier who had, in her first week, been coolly professional but not particularly warm, would catch her in the hallway after that session and say, in French first, and then in English when he remembered, "How are you doing that in your head?" It was the first time anyone on the program had asked her a question that assumed she had an interior process worth understanding. She told him. It took 40 minutes, and by the end they were sitting on the floor in the hallway, with her notebook between them, and he was working through the calculation method she used, which substituted a simplified angular equation for the standard lookup table and was, if you were comfortable with the underlying mathematics, significantly faster without meaningful accuracy loss. "This isn't in any manual," he said. "No," she said. "Did you invent this?" She thought about it. "I derived it," she said. "There's a difference." He laughed. It was the first laugh she'd heard on the program that wasn't about someone else's mistake. And it changed something in the room's temperature in a way she hadn't known she was waiting for. At week 4, there was an assessment that the program called the integration exercise, which was formally structured but informally understood to be the moment where the real ranking happened. Not the ranking on paper, but the ranking that people carried with them afterward in how they spoke to each other and who they deferred to on instinct. The integration exercise placed candidates in a multi-element scenario that required not only precision shooting but coordination with a forward observer element, communication under noise, and decision-making when the information available was incomplete and contradictory. It was, in other words, an attempt to replicate the actual conditions under which this kind of work happened in the field, conditions where your shooting ability was necessary but not sufficient. Strand was paired with a candidate named O.C., a reservist from Ontario, who had come to the program through a path that several regular force candidates considered irregular. O.C. was a large, quiet man who listened more than he spoke and who had a quality that Strand noticed immediately and appreciated. He asked clarifying questions rather than making assumptions. This sounds like a small thing. In complex environments, it is not a small thing. Their scenario involved a moving element, a civilian presence that constrained their firing solution, and a communications fault that meant they were working with information that was 2 minutes old by the time they received it. The correct response to this scenario was not to shoot faster. It was to recognize that the information delay fundamentally altered the geometry of the problem and to recalculate accordingly. Most candidates, under the time pressure and noise of the exercise, defaulted to shooting faster. Strand and OC stopped. OC held the comm line and kept the forward observer element on task, while Strand ran the recalculation for the moving element's projected position. She did it in her head, with OC quietly reading off updated reference points as they came in. When she called the solution, she said, "This is a prediction, not a confirmation. We treat it as high confidence, but not certain." She made the shot. The debrief afterward was conducted by Faulds. He went through each team's performance methodically, without particular affect. When he reached Strand and OC's sequence, he went through it in detail that he hadn't applied to any other team. Not to criticize, but to examine. He talked through the decision to stop. He talked through the recalculation. He talked through the language Strand had used in the call. Prediction, not confirmation. That phrasing matters, he said. Most candidates, when they're confident, stop qualifying their statements. Confidence and precision are not the same cognitive state. The best shooters know how to be precise about their confidence. They know the difference between "I'm sure" and "this is my best estimate given available data," and they communicate that difference under pressure. He did not say she had done it well. He described what she had done, in detail, in front of everyone. Everyone understood. On the last day of the program, the candidates were gathered for a final administrative session before their assessments were transmitted. Faulds gave a short address that was characteristic of him, spare, unadorned, containing nothing that didn't need to be there. He said that precision work was a specific form of loneliness, that it required you to be right in conditions where no one could verify your reasoning until after the moment had passed, that this was not the same as other kinds of military competence, which were more legible, more immediately confirmable. He said that the candidates who washed out of these programs, in his experience, almost never failed on the technical side. They failed because the loneliness of being right, and being doubted anyway, wore them down in ways that didn't show up in assessments. He looked at no one in particular when he said this, but Strand was aware, without being certain, that the room was briefly aware of her. After the session ended, OC found her outside. He shook her hand, which was formal, and then he said, "You know you're going to keep running into this." She looked at him. "People who need you to be slower so they feel right about their speed," he said. "It's not going to stop." "I know," she said. "Does it?" He stopped. Reconsidered. "Are you okay with that?" She thought about it for a moment longer than the question seemed to require. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give it accurately. "I'm not okay with it," she said. "But I'm used to it, which is a different thing. And I'm getting better at not letting the difference between those two things be visible." OC nodded. He seemed to find this answer both honest and unsatisfying, which was the right response to an honest and unsatisfying truth. They walked back to the building separately, which was not meaningful, and said goodbye in the parking lot, which was. Her assessment was transmitted on a Friday. She was rated distinguished on technical execution, distinguished on analytical integration, and commended on communications and team coordination. The last category was the one that candidates from precision roles most often scored lower on because the work self-selected for people who were good at being alone with a problem. Kellner received a copy as the recommending officer. He added it to a file he had kept, which contained similar documents from the other 3 candidates he had identified over the years. He did not send her a note. He had learned, from the 3rd candidate, that notes from recommending officers at early career stages could be misconstrued as ownership, as though the senior officer's belief in the candidate was the reason for the candidate's performance rather than a correct identification of something that already existed. He believed in that distinction. 2 years later, Strand was deployed as part of a joint training exercise with a NATO partner in a country she was permitted to name in casual conversation, but not in formal documentation. She was the only Canadian precision element attached to a unit whose own snipers were, by reputation, excellent, and who were, in the first 3 days of the exercise, polite in the way that implies awaiting judgment, On the fourth day, there was a live fire demonstration component. The demonstration involved a series of targets at varying distances, under time pressure, with changing wind data fed by radio every 90 seconds. It was designed to showcase combined capability, which meant every shooter went through the sequence, and the results were, in the informal way of these things, being compared. The partner nation's top shooter, a warrant officer, whose name Strand could not pronounce correctly until the sixth day, completed the sequence with a score that the gathered observers received with the kind of subdued approval that very competent people give to other very competent people. Strand went next. She completed the sequence 40 seconds faster, at the same accuracy level, because she had spent those 40 seconds identifying which targets were time critical and which could carry a longer solution interval without affecting overall performance. She had triaged. She had not simply shot faster. The partner warrant officer watched this from the side of the range. After she came off the line, he walked over to her and stood beside her for a moment, looking down range. Then he said something in his own language. The interpreter said, "He says your intervals are unusual. He wants to know if you were taught that sequence or if you reasoned it." "Tell him I reasoned it," Strand said, "but that the reasoning was built on what I was taught." The interpreter translated. The warrant officer looked at her and nodded. Once, with the slow deliberateness of someone who is acknowledging something they consider real, he said something else. "He says there is a difference," the interpreter said, "between people who learn to shoot and people who learn to think about shooting. He says it is very rare to be both." Strand said nothing. She was aware that the correct response to a compliment of that kind, from that kind of person, was not words but attention, to receive it fully, to not deflect it into politeness, and to not expand it into pride, to simply let it be what it was. She was getting better at that. Later, in the brief window of downtime at the end of the exercise day, she sat outside the temporary facility with her notebook open and the calculation from the afternoon's demonstration in front of her. Not reviewing it. She had not needed to review her calculations for a long time. She was extending it, adding a variable she had noticed during the demonstration that she hadn't had time to account for in the sequence, a microclimate effect from the terrain feature to the northwest that had been consistent across all the late session shots, and that, if she was right about it, would allow for a refinement in the initial hold data that could shave 2 seconds off the setup time without any loss of confidence. She was probably right about it. She wrote the number down. She would test it tomorrow if conditions held. The light was going flat in the way it does in that part of the world when the evening comes in low and even, and the range was quiet, and somewhere behind her she could hear the partner unit's radio operator running a comm check with the same patient repetition that comm operators everywhere use, the same phrasing in a different language. She was 29 years old and stationed temporarily in a country whose name she couldn't write in formal documentation, and she had a refinement in her notebook that was probably correct, and tomorrow she would find out. She closed the notebook and put it in her left breast pocket. Some things do not need to be said aloud to be true. The calculation either held or it didn't. The morning would tell her which. She was ready to listen.